In 1944, Italian soldiers could be seen wearing American uniforms, tending victory gardens, sharing Mass with locals, and enjoying warm meals together. Only a short time earlier, those same men had been prisoners behind barbed wire in the deserts of Texas, captured after Mussolini's failed North African campaign. A single signature on an armistice document had changed their fate entirely. Across the Atlantic, other Italians shivered in the cold, forced into exhausting labor with barely enough food to survive, despised by their captors and mistrusted by fellow inmates. They felt the full wrath of the German Reich, even though they had once fought alongside it. A few years earlier, many of them had been stationed under bright Mediterranean skies, serving on the beaches of Greece. But that same stroke of the pen had reversed everything. Rarely in modern history did the destiny of a nation's soldiers shift so completely, or so suddenly, as that of the Italian army during the Second World War. At the beginning of the conflict, Italy fought loyally beside Germany as a formal Axis ally. But when the Italian government signed the Armistice of Cassabile in 1943 and switched sides, the situation for hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers became chaotic. Overnight, troops who had once fought for Hitler became enemies of the Reich, while those already in Allied hands found themselves under a new political identity. The outcome for captured Italian soldiers varied dramatically depending on who held them. The British Empire ended up as the main custodian of Italian prisoners of war. Between the autumn of 1940 and the spring of 1941, nearly 200,000 Italians had been taken prisoner in North Africa. For reasons of security, London feared keeping so many enemy soldiers close to home. So many were shipped to far-flung corners of the Emperor Australia, South Africa, and Kenya among them. Yet by July 1941, the first Italian prisoners began arriving on British soil itself. What initially looked like a burden soon proved useful. Wartime Britain suffered a critical shortage of labor, and these men offered a ready solution. The British authorities quickly realized that Italian prisoners could serve as an important economic resource to sustain agriculture and infrastructure during the war. So, instead of keeping all of them in heavily guarded camps, many were assigned to individual farms where help was desperately needed. Each prisoner underwent screening for fascist sympathies before being sent to Britain proper. But once accepted, the security around them was surprisingly relaxed. They worked not only on farms but also in forestry, civil engineering, and public works projects, all within the boundaries of the Geneva Convention. Some even helped construct Kenya's Great North Road. Conditions differed from one site to another. But compared with other wartime labor camps, life for Italians in British custody was generally tolerable. At Camp 37 in Wincham, England, the men lived in huts. They had built themselves sturdy wooden structures, insulated against the damp British winters, each fitted with heaters, running taps, and decent lighting. They received 3 meals per day, limited to 8 hours of work, and modest pay for their labor. When they were not working, the prisoners staged plays, read books, played music, and competed in football matches against local teams and even their guards. Sundays were often reserved for Mass with nearby villagers, followed by friendly games that helped bridge the cultural gap between captors and captives. Regular mail from home kept spirits alive. Each man was allowed to send 1 letter and a postcard every week, maintaining a fragile connection with Italy. The war, however, would once again alter their status. After Italy's armistice in 1943 and the formation of Marshal Badoglio's new government aligned with the Allies, the Italian soldiers held in Britain faced a choice. Those who chose cooperation, declaring loyalty to the new Italian regime, enjoyed greater freedom of movement and better treatment. Those who refused cooperation were confined in stricter camps under tighter guard. Although Rome and many Italian families pleaded for their soldiers to be returned home, the Allies were reluctant to release such a valuable workforce. The Italian prisoners had slipped into a strange legal limbo. Technically, they were captives of a nation, now fighting on the same side. This odd status turned the Italians into a flexible labor pool that the Allied command could deploy almost anywhere, often for non-combat assignments supporting the war effort. For most, life in the United Kingdom remained stable and humane. Isolated incidents of violence or friction with civilians did occur, but compared with the treatment of prisoners elsewhere, the Italian experience under British supervision was relatively mild. About 63% of these prisoners eventually volunteered to assist the Allied cause directly. Many of them stayed in Britain long after hostilities ceased. Official repatriation took years. Some were not sent home until 1947, but others chose not to leave. Several returned later to marry the English women they had met during captivity. A quiet testament to the human connections forged amid war. Across the Atlantic, conditions were much the same. When Italian captives began falling into American hands in 1943, U.S. authorities initially hesitated to bring them onto American soil. Security concerns and public opinion made it a controversial idea. Yet again, economic need overruled caution. With millions of American men deployed overseas, the nation required workers to fill the fields and factories. Italian prisoners soon found themselves harvesting cotton, detasseling corn, digging potatoes, and performing countless other agricultural tasks across the American Midwest and South. Their living standards surprised them. One former prisoner recalled that each evening at 6 o'clock, American guards would bring paper plates and small glasses for dinner cheese, salad, a boiled egg, iced tea, and fresh grapefruit. "We thought we were in heaven," he wrote. Some camps even allowed Italian mess sergeants to design their own menus using army rations, turning ordinary food into improvised Italian dishes that fascinated nearby U.S. personnel. During their free time, the prisoners organized orchestras, played sports, and acted in theater performances. Some camps established makeshift universities where internees could study English, literature, engineering, and business. Educated men among them became instructors for their peers. The United States also launched a program that gave Italian prisoners the chance to support the Allied war effort more directly. The Italian service units, known as ISUs, roughly 75% of Italian POWs in America, joined these units voluntarily. They worked on road construction, park maintenance, logistics, and supply operations. Some even assisted in interpreting and guiding partisan groups fighting Mussolini's fascist Republic of Salo back in northern Italy. Officially, these men were still prisoners, but they were paid like American privates and could receive weekend passes. For many Italians, this cooperation brought a profound moral struggle. Joining an ISU meant, in effect, taking part, however indirectly, in a war against fellow Italians. Yet for others, the chance to escape barbed wire and contribute to what they now saw as liberation outweighed the guilt. Despite their inner conflicts, they generally enjoyed good treatment and a high standard of living compared with most prisoners of war. Still, some American civilians complained that the Italians were being pampered, and tensions occasionally flared between U.S. troops and ISU members, especially as American casualties mounted in northern Italy during 1944. It was difficult for grieving soldiers to see Italians as trustworthy allies. Even so, resentment did not erase the overall fairness of their treatment. Many Italian POAs later remembered the Americans with gratitude, one of them admitting, "They treated us too well, almost too well." After the war ended, several of these men decided never to go back. Those who had fallen in love or found opportunity in America stayed, building new lives far from the ruins of Europe. Across the Allied world, Italian prisoners generally fared better than most. They endured heavy labor and confinement, but their captors respected the Geneva Convention. The same could not be said for those who fell into German hands after Italy's surrender in 1943. When Italy broke from the Axis, German forces launched Operation Axis, swiftly occupying large portions of the Italian peninsula and its overseas territories. The Italian army, already exhausted and demoralized, collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers were scattered, confused, and unsure whether to fight, flee, or surrender. Some joined local partisan groups to resist the Nazis. Others laid down their arms, only to be rounded up by their former comrades. The Germans offered them a grim choice: continue fighting alongside the Axis under Mussolini's resurrected regime in the north, disarm and be sent to labor camps, or face summary execution. The result was mass capture on a staggering scale. Historians estimate that roughly 800,000 Italians were taken prisoner by the Germans. A small minority agreed to serve in the puppet army of the Italian Social Republic. The overwhelming majority refused, unwilling to keep fighting for a cause they no longer believed in, even if that decision condemned them to life in German camps. To the Nazis, these men were not prisoners of war in the legal sense. They were traitors. Berlin remembered Italy's defection in 1915 during the First World War, and now in 1943, it saw the same betrayal repeated. German camp authorities deliberately avoided classifying them as ordinary posts protected by the Geneva Convention. Instead, they were relabeled Italian military internisti. Is a bureaucratic trick that stripped them of international rights. Later in the war, many were reclassified again as civilian workers, further eliminating any Red Cross oversight. Without that protection, they were exposed to abuse, malnutrition, and lethal working conditions. Italian internees were forced into agriculture, mining, and factory labor under brutal discipline. Food rations were meager, shelters inadequate, winters freezing. Diseases like tuberculosis spread rapidly. Hundreds perished from illness, and thousands more from exhaustion and exposure. Guards routinely shot anyone who appeared unwilling or too weak to work. The annual death rate hovered around 40 per thousand, about 4 times higher than the average among Western European posts held by Germany. These Italians endured isolation not only from their homeland, but also from fellow captives. British, French, and even Soviet prisoners often despised them as former enemies. To the Germans, they were treated traitors. To others, they were the enemy of yesterday. The humiliation was complete. Men who had once marched proudly in Mussolini's armies now shoveled coal in freezing mines, starving and beaten, with no certainty they would ever see home again. It was a cruel paradox. While Italian soldiers in Allied custody played football and attended Sunday Mass, their compatriots in the Reich were dying in silence behind factory walls. Their only crime was loyalty to a country that had changed sides. In the final months of the war, even after the official surrender of Germany, the suffering of Italian prisoners was far from over. For many, peace did not mean freedom. The end of the conflict only marked the beginning of another ordeal: captivity under new masters. While some were released quickly, thousands of Italians found themselves transferred, not homeward, but into the custody of nations like France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. There were 2 principal paths that led Italian soldiers into Soviet camps. Some were taken prisoner during the disastrous campaigns on the Eastern Front, captured by the Red Army amidst the frozen wastelands of Russia. Others, ironically, were first liberated from German control, only to be taken again by the advancing Soviets. The journey for both groups would prove equally cruel. Throughout 1945, entire battalions of exhausted men were deported from temporary camps in Poland to faraway Soviet labor facilities. One such camp near Kirov became a graveyard for many. Out of roughly 65,000 Italians captured by the Soviets, only around 20,000 ever made it back. The death toll was staggering, a 57% casualty rate, far higher than that of German or Romanian prisoners. This immense loss was not simply due to executions or direct mistreatment, but to the horrific circumstances under which these men were captured and forced to survive. Most of them were taken during the retreat after the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most catastrophic defeats in modern warfare. The Italian divisions, part of the Axis Army Group, were left exposed on the long, icy plains of the Don River. When the Soviet counterattack began, the Italians were forced to march back through 500 kilometers of snow-covered steppe without supplies, without proper clothing, and without hope. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and even the strongest among them began to collapse. Many died on the road, not from enemy bullets, but from frostbite, starvation, and disease. Typhus and malnutrition spread like wildfire. Those who survived the march were herded into overcrowded cattle cars, locked inside for days without food or air, and sent eastward into the heart of the Soviet Union. The camps that awaited them were bleak places, a world of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The Italians, who had once served the fascist dream of conquest, now shoveled snow and dug trenches in foreign soil. For the Soviets, they were both enemies and tools, men to be worked, re-educated, or simply forgotten. Some Soviet officials saw these Italians not only as prisoners, but as potential converts. They believed that, given the right ideological guidance, the soldiers could be turned into loyal communists. The Italian representative to the Comintern, the International Communist Organization, even appealed to Moscow for better treatment of these men, suggesting that they could become brothers in ideology if treated with leniency. A few Italians did volunteer for such indoctrination programs. The reason was simple: the camps designated for political re-education were less deadly than the others. Food was slightly better, the guards less brutal. Many pretended enthusiasm for Marxist teachings simply to survive another winter. Yet, even in this grim landscape, moments of unexpected humanity emerged. Surviving veterans later recall that, while Soviet guards could be harsh, the local civilians were often kind. Starving villagers, themselves with nothing, shared bread or offered a piece of warm clothing. Some Russian peasants even helped the sick escape work details, risking punishment from their own authorities. Still, for most, the Soviet camps were a slow death. By the time the repatriations began in August 1945, the war in the Pacific was still ongoing. Japan had not yet surrendered, and yet the Soviet government already made its decision to start sending prisoners home. It was a rare act of efficiency, though the process itself would drag on for more than a year. By the end of 1946, those who had survived, skeletal, sick, and haunted, finally began to return to Italy. But what they came home to was not the country they had left. The Italy they once fought for had changed beyond recognition. When Italy switched sides in 1943, the country had split in two. A northern fascist state, still loyal to Mussolini, and a southern kingdom, now under Allied protection. This civil war within a world war left deep scars that would last for decades. After Mussolini's fall, the new government in the south, led by Marshal Badoglio, claimed to represent a reborn Italy, free from fascism. But in truth, little had changed. Many of the same military officers, bureaucrats, and party officials who had served Mussolini continued to hold power. There were promises of justice, promises to punish those responsible for Italy's role in the Axis and the atrocities committed abroad. Yet justice proved selective. One shocking example was General Mario Rota, who had overseen brutal ethnic cleansing campaigns in Slovenia and Croatia. Instead of facing trial, Rota was appointed chief of staff of the Italian army under the new regime. His orders even included firing on peaceful protesters in Rome. It was only removed when the Allies intervened. The Italian military itself was barely purged. Entire fascist formations, such as the notorious Black Shirt Brigades, were absorbed into the Royal Army almost intact. Officers who had sworn loyalty to Mussolini simply changed uniforms, while high-ranking fascist officials continued to draw state pensions. However, as the fascist stronghold in northern Italy collapsed in 1945, the mood shifted sharply. Mussolini's own fate, captured, executed, and strung up by partisans in Milan, symbolized the vengeance that was sweeping across the land. The so-called people's courts began to appear across liberated cities. Encouraged by partisan leaders, these courts tried fascists and collaborators, often handing down death sentences with little evidence or due process. The Allied declaration that all members of Mussolini's Republic of Salo were to be treated as prisoners of war was ignored. For many Italians, legal definitions meant little. What mattered was revenge. In cities like Milan and Turin, mobs stormed prisons, dragging suspected fascists into the streets. Many were beaten, executed, or hanged in public squares. The government tried to stop the killings, especially after Mussolini's death, but its authority was fragile. In one infamous case in Rome, partisans hunted down a former prison director accused of torturing their comrades and murdered him in cold blood. A year later, masked gunmen entered a prison and killed 55 fascist inmates while they slept. Those who weren't executed faced a slower, more miserable punishment. Italy's prisons were overcrowded, filthy, and chaotic. In Colano prison, built to hold a few thousand, over 30,000 inmates were crammed inside. The young men slept in mud, drank contaminated water, and received barely enough food to survive. The women's prisons were no better. The Red Cross itself described one as nothing more than a cesspool. Even these brutal conditions couldn't stop corruption. Powerful fascists with the right connections could easily escape. Some bribed guards to let them walk out the front gate. Others forged papers that allowed them to legally flee to Switzerland or Spain. Those who had served the regime but had friends in high places quietly disappeared from Italy altogether. If you're finding this story as fascinating as it is tragic, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we explore untold stories like this, moments of courage, betrayal, and survival from the pages of history. Your support helps bring forgotten voices back to life. By 1946, the violence began to subside. Italy, exhausted and divided, wanted peace, not just from war, but from memory itself. The monarchy, long associated with fascism, was abolished by popular vote. A new republic was declared, a democratic Western-facing Italy, eager to leave its past behind. In the spirit of national healing, the government announced a sweeping amnesty on June 22, 1946. It was presented as an act of forgiveness, but in practice, it meant that thousands of fascists and collaborators were simply released without punishment. Christian democratic leaders, backed by the Church, argued that forgiveness was a Christian virtue that Italy could not rebuild while trapped in cycles of vengeance. For many ordinary Italians, this decision was deeply painful. Families who had lost loved ones to the regime saw murderers walk free. Others, wary of hatred, accepted the amnesty as a necessary step toward rebuilding. In the political landscape of the new Italy, the legacy of captivity became a powerful symbol. The government sought to reshape its national narrative to present Italy not as an aggressor in the war, but as another victim of tyranny. The suffering of Italian soldiers in Nazi and Soviet camps became central to this story. Those brutalized by the Nazis were portrayed as victims of betrayal, men who had fought honorably but been abandoned by their German allies. Meanwhile, the fate of those who had perished in Soviet hands was used as political ammunition in the growing Cold War. Proof of the cruelty of communism, paradoxically, Italian soldiers who had been held by the Western Allies in the United States or Britain were largely forgotten. They did not fit neatly into the new national myth. Italy wanted heroes and martyrs, not awkward reminders of defeat and collaboration. In the years that followed, survivors of Soviet camps wrote memoirs haunting recollections of starvation, endless work, and the bitter cold. Many said that decades later, they still woke in the night, sweating from dreams of the Gulag. When they tried to tell their stories, few wanted to listen. In communist circles, their accounts were dismissed as propaganda. To many young Italians, especially those inspired by Marxist ideals, such testimonies were exaggerations, relics of an old world they wanted to forget. Families were divided, brothers and sons taking different sides in politics, accusing one another of betrayal. Soldiers who returned found no place in the new Italy. Many were sick, disabled, or mentally broken. The pensions they received were meager, barely enough to live on. Some sought a fresh start abroad. Those who had been prisoners in the United States or Britain often chose to stay, or later returned to those countries to rebuild their lives far from the ruins of Europe. For them, the idea of Italy had become distant, a homeland that no longer felt like home. In the end, their story, the story of Italy's forgotten prisoners, is one of quiet tragedy. They fought for a cause that collapsed, suffered for nations that no longer existed, and returned to a society that wanted to forget them. Their war did not end with the Armistice. It followed them into peace, shaping their dreams, their families, and the soul of modern Italy. When we remember the Second World War, we often think of battles, victories, and famous leaders. But history's true weight lies in these hidden lives, the men who survived captivity, endured humiliation, and carried the scars long after the world had moved on. Their suffering reminds us that the end of war is not always the end of pain, and that peace, for some, never truly arrives.